Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Charlotte O'Donnell. She has worked as a journalist and as a technical writer and editor, publishing across a wide range of topics and disciplines from medical journal articles to education policy handbooks. Johns Hopkins Engineering is pleased to present this writing webinar. Charlotte, you can go ahead and share your screen now and begin the presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sandra. And thank you guys all for joining the webinar tonight. I'm so happy to be here. I've been doing these for a little while now, and you guys are a fantastic audience. So as Sandra just told you, my name is Charlotte O'Donnell, and I am going to be your guide tonight. And one of the reasons I've been giving these webinars for so long is that I have taught technical writing at Johns Hopkins for more than a decade now. And I've worked with a lot of young engineering professionals on their writing and making their writing more effective. So the topic tonight is thinking about your role as a professional engineer, as a storyteller, which might sound kind of out there, but it's actually a pretty popular topic these days. This webinar is going to sort of delve into the details of what it means to write an objective technical narrative. And I would like to suggest to you that it is a kind of art form. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I wanted to make sure that you guys have all pulled up the two documents or the two links that I sent out in the chat window right now. This webinar is going to be a little bit interactive. The way it's going to work is at different points during the webinar, I'm going to pose a question to the group, and it looks like there are almost 70 of you tonight, which is so exciting to me. And I'll pose a question to the group. There will be a question that will actually display on my slides. When you pull up that website, you actually can type your response into the little chat window right there on the website. And when you click the submit button, it will show up on my slide. And so actually 3 of the 4 questions that are going to be in this webinar tonight are word cloud type questions. So that gives you a sense of how your response will show up. There's one response towards the end that's going to be a little bit more freeform. And so you should be able to respond that way to the freeform question, and you'll be able to see it when it shows up on the slide. As Sandra explained to you guys, I am asking that you use the website rather than the text option to this poll tonight, if at all humanly possible. It's definitely possible to text your answers into the poll, but because of the number of people on this webinar tonight, you won't, we're a little worried that actually the text function will cause some chaos. So do us a favor and pull up the website. The second link that you got in the chat window is a link to a pretty famous paper that I've imported into a Google document. It's a paper you might know about the discovery of the structure of DNA. It's a 1953 paper that was published in Nature. You're not going to read the entire thing tonight, although it is a pretty short paper, so it would be feasible. Later parts of this presentation are going to look at it as an example for what I'm going to talk with you guys about tonight. And you're going to assess it a little bit and see if you can pick out some of the principles that I described to you. So without further ado, moving forward, where did we come up with this idea of an engineer as a storyteller? How crazy is that? I'm joking. A lot of you guys probably already know that there is a certain amount of artful storytelling that's part of the engineering profession, but I wanted to foreground for you guys tonight that the leadership of the Engineering for Professionals program, I've been doing these webinars for a while, and I've presented on a number of different ideas from this book that you see on this slide right over here on the right. It's Joshua Schimmel's Writing Science. And I bring this book up often when I give webinars and when I teach in the classroom to young technical writers, because it is excellent. I cannot rave about it enough. All of the really great science and engineering writers that I know love this book. It is so rich with information. You'll learn so much from it, and not just about sentence level writing, really about how to write papers that win all the funding, get you all the citations, basically produce the most beautiful explanation of your scientific and engineering work that you've ever imagined you'd be able to do. So obviously we can't talk about everything that's in this book tonight. It's more than we can cover. I am going to focus just on the first 2 chapters of the book with you guys this evening, which are some nice introductory topics. Chapter 1 focuses on the value of writing in science, and Chapter 2 focuses on how scientific writing is a kind of storytelling. I should say that if you haven't read the first 2 chapters of this book, you will easily be able to follow along with this webinar no matter what. If you have read the first 2 chapters of the book, I think this webinar will still bring some new content and ideas to you this evening. There will be some stuff that will be a re-explanation of some of the writing in the book, but you'll have the opportunity to interact with your peers and see how they're responding to it. And I'm going to dig a little deeper into one particular example that's brought up in Chapter 2. It's an interpretation of that very famous scientific paper about DNA. So, moving forward, I think a critical sort of background idea here to everything that we're going to talk about tonight is that writing is a critical part of good STEM. Whether you're in the hard sciences, whether you're a medical professional, whether you're an engineer, it doesn't matter how groundbreaking your ideas are. If no one reads and cites your paper, you won't get anywhere. And it's sort of a sad fact, because you'd like to think that good ideas just get you all the attention and the fame and the professional success that you've ever wanted. But the sad reality is that it doesn't really work that way. The trick is really that you have to get people to read your paper these days. And after they read your paper, they have to respond positively, which is no small feat. Perhaps in simpler times, I don't know when those simpler times were, honestly, but there's an idea that exists out there that, maybe it was at some point possible to take another colleague scientist by the hand and bring them into your lab consistently, all of them that were interested in your work, and give them a tour of all of your equipment and show them your spreadsheets upon spreadsheets of data, and show them what excites you the most about your work. But the reality is that we don't do that these days. You can't take all of your colleagues and potential collaborators in the future by the hand and show them your work. And you don't frequently even have the opportunity to give good oral presentations about your work. Only if you're very lucky do you get to do that. In large part, what you have to do is you have to communicate the value of your scientific work through writing, through reports, proposals, and also obviously published studies in scientific journals. So with all that said, I thought that I would open with a question just to kind of get you guys thinking. If you can go to the Poll Everywhere webpage right now and start thinking about this question, I would love to hear it. Say you want to write a really stellar scientific paper or a paper about your engineering, and you've finished your research. You finished your research yesterday, and now you know it's time to sit down to do the writing. What's the first thing you think you need to do when you sit down to do the writing? Now, this is a word cloud response. You could enter one word into the poll. Great. I love that someone's already responded. If you want to enter a phrase and have it show up as a phrase, you can use tildes between your words. Ooh, outline, scope, story, plan, brainstorm. Fantastic. I'm going to give it another minute and see how this word cloud grows. Ooh, thesis. Related. Good. Sections. Express. Ooh. Background. I love brainstorming. Scope. Relevance. Organization. Big. Ooh, big methods. This word cloud is growing in an incredible way. compiling, thinking about coherence, think about pitching. Fantastic responses, everyone, so far. Understand audience. Wow, information is in there. Background research. Incredible. I'm going to let it continue to grow, and I'll just maybe like talk a little bit about what I'm seeing here. I love that I'm seeing audience and outlining and brainstorming and thesis as sort of bigger words in this word cloud. The more responses that contain those words, the bigger those words get in the word cloud. That's how it works. But one of the interesting things that I'm seeing here is there are a lot of little words, which I think is actually a really smart thing to think about here, because my experience when I've been working with young technical writers is that there are a lot of different ways to approach this first stage in beginning to write. And I just get a lot of complex answers. People tell me all kinds of wild stories about what the beginning of the writing process means to them. And I think we don't often talk about it. But I think one of the things that's like here, right, is that I don't see a lot of people talking immediately about sentences. And I don't see people like talking immediately about specific like details of data and like details of explanation. I see a lot of words that are thinking about framing, that are thinking about organization. And I think one of the reasons why I bring this up is because I think all of these ideas here are sort of like, they're very interestingly sort of connected to the thinking process, right? And in many ways, I think what's really interesting is the beginning processes of the writing are very much tangled up with and married to the process of thinking. And so I asked you guys to sort of, I really wish I could screenshot this word cloud. It's so great. But it brings me to this passage in chapter 1 of Schimmel that I love. And he basically, he opens his book talking about how these two ideas of what it means to write and what it means to think are very intricately connected. And so I think I'll read it to you guys now because I find it really inspiring. This is actually, it's not a quote from Schimmel himself. This is Schimmel quoting Scott Montgomery, who is the editor of the Chicago Guide to Communicating Science. And Scott Montgomery says, "I ask, finally, that you avoid one error of belief that is monstrously prevalent. This is the widespread notion that to write clearly, you must first think clearly. This sharp maxim may appear logical, but it is really rubbish. No matter how rational your thought may be or appear to be on a particular problem, no matter how detailed your intentions and plottings, the act of writing will almost always prove rebellious, full of unforeseen difficulties, sidetracks, blind alleys, revelations. Good, clear writing, writing that teaches and informs without confusion, emerges from a process of struggle, or, if you prefer, litigation. Most often, the terms of the formula given above need to be reversed. Clear thinking can emerge from clear writing. Imposing order by organizing and expressing ideas has great power to clarify. In many cases, writing is the process through which scientists come to understand the real form and implications of their work." And I think as a writer myself and as someone who works with a lot of technical writers, I mean, I find this piece really moving because a lot of people, when they're first coming to technical writing, trying to figure out how even just to write like a baseline decent paper, they get really overwhelmed. And they think that like when they write their first draft, that first draft, if they were a better writer, would come out like perfect and eloquent, like immediately the first time. But the truth is that a lot of really exceptional scientific writings have been a complete mess for the first couple drafts. And it's actually the messiness and reviewing the messiness with peers and, self-reviewing their own work and revising it, that has actually been the process of producing clearer and better science. So this quote here on this early slide in this presentation, it's really going to guide a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight. It does tie into this idea of storytelling, which I will eventually get to. So moving on. I think what these two chapters eventually get after is this idea that the real work in writing any kind of scientific paper that is of solid merit it's really about organizing and framing information. If you don't organize and frame it in a way that is compelling for your reader, it's kind of a moot point. Like why even put in that work of putting words on paper? So I think there are a number of different ways to think about organizing and framing information. If I were to just highlight some general ways of talking about this, it might be about picking and choosing which data points you're presenting. It's almost certainly always about the order in which you present your data, or even different concepts and the data connected to those concepts. It's learning to draw out contrast and comparison and other analyses. And I bring this up because I think frequently it's not always thought of in that way. A lot of beginning scientific writers, they think that, you know, outlining their paper and thinking about it is really just like kind of going through their spreadsheet and like maybe talking about, well, these numbers came first and these numbers came second and these numbers came third. That's just not quite enough. And probably many of you guys have discovered this in the process of trying to write about your own findings. The data it never really speaks for itself. So for whatever reason, and there are a lot of reasons that we don't really have time to talk about in depth this evening, there's a bit of a disconnect between conventions for writing excellent papers in STEM fields and conventions for writing excellent papers in fields that are closer to the humanities. And I mean, you can definitely say that it definitely causes some audiences a certain amount of frustration. Obviously, more expert audiences will have an easier time with it, but even audiences that are very familiar with some of the conventions of writing scientific papers frequently express a kind of like frustration at reading their peers' work. It's interesting, I think, in a way, that there is a kind of difference in the way we think about writing scientific papers and the way we think about writing humanistic papers. But maybe to get at this concept, I thought I would have you guys respond to another word cloud poll. What I want you to do for this one, in a word or two, what principles or ideas are central to a scientific paper in your mind? If you just had to describe the cliche, and that's not to say there aren't better ways to do this, but what ideas are foregrounded to you? Take a minute. Concise. Okay, good. Concise, data, objective, technical, groundbreaking, clear, objective, hypothesis, novel, technicality. Ooh, yes, good. I'm going to give it another minute to grow. Some really fascinating answers here on the slide. I love that I see communication in here, and words, discussion methods, communicating objectively. Honest, that's good. Proof, analysis, bias, oh yes. Count, truth. Wonderful. I'm going to continue to let this grow, and I'll just sort of maybe try to synthesize some of the things I'm seeing here. I think there's a lot of good stuff that I'm seeing in this word cloud, and I'm glad to see that clear and coherent and concise are a big part of how everybody thinks about approaching a good scientific paper, because all of those things are true. I also see a lot of things, like if I had to give the emphasis in here, we clearly think of like data and hypothesis first, and we think of objective. We think of a lot of sort of like technical points, right, as the things, the components of scientific papers that sort of make them distinct from other papers in the humanity. And it's interesting to me that despite the fact that what we're really talking about is still a paper, right, or some sort of communication, that these words don't fully align with what communication professionals who do sort of multidisciplinary work talk about when they talk about like really effective and sticky communication that is memorable and lasting and makes an impact on audiences. That's not to say that good communication isn't possible in the sciences and that it doesn't happen. It happens all the time. And it happens in phenomenal ways. But I think there is a kind of consensus out there that a lot of people working in STEM fields, they say, well, you know, good writing, they don't really see it as like the norm for whatever reason. And these reasons, a lot of them don't have to do with like anything to do with the fault of anyone in the scientific community at all. And so what Schimmel starts to build to in the first 2 chapters of the book is that this sort of way we talk about scientific writing and the way it's like different than the way we talk about like humanistic writing, in many ways it's not fully serving us. And that's not to say that we can't still work within scientific conventions to present our work, but like if there's something really weird and disconnected that's going on when all of our emphasis on like how to effectively communicate is on like data and objectivity. One of the fallouts of this that people talk about all the time is that there's a huge gap in the public's understanding of science, because like people within the niche scientific community, they can sort of roughly understand one another, mostly, I hope, although I know I hear a lot of stories from my students. Anyway, they can mostly sort of understand one another, but then when it comes to translating that message into people that are sort of outside their super technical niche circles that know a lot of very specific things about very weird different kinds of sciences that no one else knows about, well, it's lost obviously to your average citizen. There's a Pew study which I don't know how you guys will feel about, but it basically looked at the ideas within the scientific community on which their general consensus. So like, I think they determined general consensus, at least like 85% of the scientific community agrees that like these ideas are real and important and backed up by data and worth listening to. Things like global warming is real and is probably caused by human activity, or like evolution. While like between 85 and 95% of scientists agree on these things, when you look at what the public really believes in, it's usually only between, in some cases it was low as in the 40%, like 48%, and as high as like 60%. So only like 48 to 60% of Americans are on board with these like generally accepted scientific truths. And so Schimmel he spends a certain amount of time in these introductory chapters sort of talking about how, not necessarily that he wants to change everything about science, but he sort of talks about like, well, it just seems like such a shame to him that there could be so much mistrust in scientific communities for some basic principles of rhetoric that could really serve us. And what if there were a way to marry those principles of rhetoric more strongly into the writing of scientific papers? What if at the same time we talked about objectivity, we were also talking about you know, how we frame, how we assert a particular stance on what data means. And this sort of comes out of what he sees, and also what I have seen in working with a lot of young scientific writers, like this kind of resistance to some of these particular approaches to writing. It's strange to me in a way, like only in the sciences do I encounter students and professionals that are kind of resistant to using words. Like they would much rather use numbers to explain what they mean. And that's not to say that there isn't a place for a number, but like I have worked with a lot of students that are like numbers over all things all the time, no exceptions. And like obviously that kind of hard and fast rule is going to limit a paper in some ways. Also some resistance to things like explaining numbers. There's this idea that's, I've worked with some students, they just feel like the numbers, they should speak for themselves. They are objective truth. They do not need my interpretation of them. My interpretation of them will make them less objective and therefore will dock my credibility in writing this paper. There's also some resistance in some cases to describing who is doing the work. Even when the work is actually being performed by like 5 or 6 different research teams in different locations across the country, and we're like raising questions of authorship, I still see a lot of students who are really hesitant to talk about who does what. Instead, they feel more comfortable feeling like, well, no, the experiment is merely performed, like as if by God, but we know that's not true either. A little bit of resistance to writing introductions too. A lot of younger writers are like, well, if I'm going to be objective and neutral, it's just much easier for me to start with procedure or start with results. And that's not to say there's not a time to do that sometimes, but this last point I think is something that comes up again and again, and you can sort of see this through all different parts of a scientific paper, but a lot of hesitation all the time about inserting any language that interprets, because there's this real fear of subjectivity in a scientific paper. And nobody wants to come off as subjective. They want to be this neutral, super objective force that is the force of reason. And so Schimmel talks about how this resistance to some of these principles that are central to humanities papers, sort of coming out of this idea that these principles of humanities papers, somehow they're really about how like all humanities people, all they want to do is like write fiction or create whimsical and purposeless description, or, you know, produce documents that are basically full of baseless conjecture. And so like they want to sort of throw out these principles of rhetoric on the basis that there's a kind of like misunderstanding basically of what a lot of these principles in humanities writing, even in literature, I should say, which is fiction, there's a misunderstanding of like what these writers are after. In fact, when you are a journalist, or even when you write literary fiction, if you're a novelist, one of the interesting things, if you begin to actually drill down and practice the art of these crafts, you'll find that the driving principle of journalism and literature, it's definitely not to create like fiction or just to make stuff up or just produce, you know, sentence upon sentence of whimsical, useless description. No, that's not what they're after. What these practices are about, they're really about inquiry. Journalists and even creative writers, the creation of really fantastic and lasting works, it's driven by this sense of insatiable curiosity, right? They don't just want to make stuff up. They want to create something that gets close to the truth. And the truth is what makes their message stick, even if it is fiction. And the only way they can begin to produce that kind of truth for a reader in journalism, it is obviously an actual or at least attempted truth. In literature, it's a different kind of truth, truth about humanity, maybe. But it's about that curiosity, and it's about that process of inquiring and even litigating to a certain extent. We're going to get into that in a minute. But I mean, as this turns out, as you guys are probably guessing, this is the same sort of spirit that drives all of the best science, right? So Schimmel's trying to suggest that, like, we probably, as members of the scientific community, we shouldn't be that skeptical about it. Like, these are going to be useful principles for us. And how do we sort of get after these principles? How do we produce truth via inquiry? Well, in the humanities, we have this convention of telling stories to produce a kind of truth or understanding of the world. And so, like, maybe like a broader definition of what a story is outside of this idea of literary story is that story is a way of drawing out a kind of analysis to develop a reader's understanding of how the world works. Again, it's not about just making stuff up. And you might wonder, well, how is it that scientific papers can get a little closer to developing story? Well, so what Schimmel says is scientific papers can absolutely use story. It's just that too few of them have fully developed stories that exist out there on the internet or in published print journals. He talks about this idea of kind of spectrum of story, from sort of like nascent, non-existent story to fully developed story over here on the right that goes with understanding, because what a story is a way to develop a reader's understanding of how the world works. But you know, when you're just starting out and you're an early stage STEM professional, you're creating some experiments and you're gathering some data. And a lot of times it's just sort of enough for you to collect that data and slightly refine it, right? And sort of refined data, just more slightly combed through data. What we're at then is a sort of stage of a paper that's really just more about information, which is, it's a thing you can do. And it can be a useful thing for some other people, but it's not going to be, the paper that's going to get you the critical acclaim that you probably want. He says that maybe the next stage that writers get to when they become more sophisticated is sort of taking that information, that refined data, and making it usable, answering like how the data fits together, how it works, transforming it then into a kind of knowledge. And there are some papers that get to the knowledge stage, but the optimal stage that you want to get to, and the stage that is really closest to pure story, is this idea of papers that have achieved the understanding phase, when they've taken knowledge, and made it not just usable information, made it not just understandable in terms of how it relates, but also in terms of like why it works that way. And when you start to begin to sort of add in this why explanation, then you get to a point where somebody can read your paper and they can, in reading your paper, generate a new kind of knowledge on their own. And as I said, we get a lot of papers that get just to the information stage, and a few papers get to the knowledge stage. But this last stage that is understanding, it's pretty rare. And that's not because there aren't a lot of smart people out there, and it's not because there aren't a lot of STEM professionals that can't write. Like, there are plenty of STEM professionals that can write. It is incredibly difficult to produce a paper of the caliber that's sort of associated with this last phase. It takes a lot of practice, a lot of effort, and a lot of time. Schimmel sort of like continues on, and he says, okay, so if we're going to begin to think like a writer in a humanistic or in a humanities type tradition, and approach the writing in our scientific papers like the storytelling in other disciplines, then he says that really what we have to think about is this wonderful Raymond Carver quote. And I don't know if you guys know Raymond Carver, but a long time ago I read a lot of Raymond Carver, and he's a wonderful writer, and I recommend all of his short stories. He has some books on writing too, which are really great. And he says this thing that's very true. He says, good story can't just be devised. You don't just make stuff up. It has to be distilled. And so what do we mean when we talk about distilling story? Well, what Schimmel suggests is that when we talk about distilling story, what we're talking about is we're talking about listening to our characters and figuring out how and why they act. So there's this idea, right, that like fiction writers, they just sort of create a character out of thin air and they plop them down on the page and they just make them do something. But I mean, I can tell you as a writer who's written in a lot of different disciplines, it's just not how it works. If you just make up a story, I don't know if any of you guys have tried creative writing, and you just make any old thing happen, frequently what you end up creating is not really believable writing. What you end up creating is sort of like this like false narrative where like you don't really believe in the character and things seem sort of disjointed and it doesn't really get at the truth. What writers do and journalists do is they look at their characters, or journalists look at the evidence, and they interrogate them. They like litigate everything that they know about that character, and they try to think really intensely about like, well, what would this character do in this situation? They go back to the evidence and they think, well, does that really line up with like this other piece of evidence here? What if I change the situation in this way? What if I changed it in that way? And you know, a lot of times the building of a story is a lot about like revising. First, you think a character does one thing, but then you realize that can't be true because of something else you wrote. And so you go back and you rewrite, you revise the story. And it's only in this sort of process of continuing to interrogate, listening more closely, seeing how the details really fit together in a way that not just you believe, but like a lot of other people believe. That's how you get to a really convincing story. And for those of you guys that are worried, like, well, what does this really have to do with scientific writing? I don't write characters in my scientific papers or my reports or my proposals. I would like to suggest to you that yes, you do. It's just that your characters look a little different from like the characters in Dostoevsky or Austen or any other Carver short story that you've read. Your characters are things like molecules. They might be scientific instruments. They might be data sets. They might be equations. They might be different research teams that are performing the work that you're trying to investigate. The second thing that goes into this process of distilling an effective story is this idea of drawing out the plot. And this is really hard. This takes many creative writers a very long time to nail down. But the main thing that's involved with plot is a central problem. There's a truism in fiction writing. It says like, if you don't have a problem, you don't have a plot. You don't have a story if you don't have a problem. And if you start a story by like giving the solution right away, if you just write the ending at the beginning, you also don't have a story. There's like no reason for a reader to keep reading. And like also you've really done nothing to develop a reader's understanding of your story in a convincing way. It's that process of drawing out plot which convinces a reader and shows them why what you're saying is really true. So how this works in fiction and in journalism and in science is that typically you have a character that's kind of interacting with a problem, and you sort of draw it out bit by bit. You sort of start by just giving us a small little interaction between the character and the problem, and then you add a little bit more to that character's interaction with the problem, and then you add a little more and a little more and a little more until you get closer to either the character solving the problem or impacting the problem in some kind of way. And I should point out here that this is obviously, it's really important that you don't automatically assume that an audience is going to understand what is going on between the character and the problem. A lot of times writers are very carefully sort of picking and choosing, illuminating what is problematic, what is impacted, or other ways that like whatever is going on in the story relates to the problem. It's this sort of constant relating back to the problem that makes it a story that makes it memorable. And if you're wondering, well, I don't really have a problem in my science. Like, why would I want to make science about a problem? That sounds like not a winning proposal. Well, another way of talking about problem is really just your research question. In all STEM fields, what you're dealing with is some problem generally of an unknown. There is something that is not known and you want to know it. And how are you going to fill that knowledge gap? How do the facts fit in there into that gap of the knowledge? How does that increase our understanding of the world? So finally, getting to the Watson and Crick paper from 1953. Super well regarded, incredibly well cited. I thought I would give you a very brief tour of it. And so if you haven't accessed that Google document link, I do recommend that you access the Google document link because you might be able to read the paper a little bit better in the Google Doc than you can in the excerpt that I put on this slide. How did they go about telling a story in their scientific paper? Well, I mean, first off, they did tell a story, and that's one of the reasons why it is so well regarded and so well cited. It's really considered to be the gold standard, or have achieved a gold standard of sorts in the scientific community in terms of how it's written. It's so simple. It's very short. You'll see if you just skim through to the end of it. And it's very clear too. It's like this highly condensed, crystallized explanation of how DNA is structured. And they came to it through this same process. They came to it through interrogating the evidence. And what's, I think, really interesting about this paper is that, and perhaps even controversial in some people's minds, but we won't get to that part, but they didn't actually produce any data themselves for this paper. They didn't come up with any scientific procedures. They did not gather any information at all other than stuff that had already been published in other people's papers. And teams in the decades before they published their paper in 1953 had basically produced papers that had produced a bunch of other knowledge. There were sort of things that seemed like it was pretty generally agreed upon. And so some other research teams had uncovered like what some of the known molecules were in DNA, including the bases. They'd also uncovered some information about probable distances between some of the molecules. One pretty famous team that got really close to being like the winner for having fully uncovered the structure, they produced a really interesting X-ray, which is the only photographic image you can see on this slide. And you can see that the X-ray sort of reveals this interesting X shape, which was highly significant. People were trying to figure out like, well, how is it that DNA can be shaped like this and form an X? Other research teams uncovered some rules that governed how the pairs connected to one another. And there was sort of this other piece of research that existed out there that was less like discovered truths as like discovered untruths, like things that people had sort of like proposed and had been ruled out. There were a bunch of other models of DNA that people thought were not quite as good. So Watson and Crick, they were aware of all of these things when they sat down, and like the beginning of their process was really beginning to interrogate the evidence. And just to sort of return to some of my earlier points, before I sort of get to like what exactly it meant to interrogate the evidence from Watson and Crick's point of view, there's a lot of, or what Schimmel tries to suggest in the second chapter of his book is that there's a real difference between the Franklin paper, which produced this X-ray image of DNA, and the Watson and Crick paper. The Franklin paper basically only made it about to the knowledge stage. They sort of produced some refined data sets that basically gave a kind of explanation about how these components came together, but they didn't really have a clear understanding of why. And the reason why Watson and Crick's paper stuck and became so critically acclaimed is because Watson and Crick not only sort of talked about how all these parts came together, but they talked about why they came together in the way they did. And the way Watson and Crick went about trying to figure out both the how and the why of their model is they actually sat down at a desk and they had a bunch of pieces of paper and they had wire, and they really just, they played a puzzle game for months, apparently. And they, you know, they had all the evidence in front of them. They looked at all these rules that they knew about, and they interrogated all of that data, and they made a model, and they would interrogate the model via the data again. And if something didn't quite fit, they would change the model, and they would interrogate it again and again and again and again. And eventually they came up with this pretty wonderfully simple double helix structure, which eventually not only explained like how the pieces came together, but why putting them together in this way, why it allowed for the replication of DNA itself, which was also another big mystery. And so that was how everybody started citing their paper all the time. So I thought that it might be useful here towards the end of this webinar for you guys to take a look at the first, 5 paragraphs technically of this pretty famous paper. And I think, so I put the first 5 paragraphs, and a couple of the paragraphs are super short, up here on the slide. But if you could just take a minute and read this opening section and try to pick out in your mind first, what do you think the compelling characters are? And what do you think a compelling question or problem is here? Where are they introduced? What are they? And so I'm just going to give you a minute. Timing you on my phone right now. I'd sing the Jeopardy song, but I don't want to do that to you because it would be pretty out of tune. So. And I'm going to change the slide to the Poll Everywhere response slide. If some of you guys still want to take a look at the paper, it's a good reason to have the Google document pulled up. But if some of you guys want to take a crack at what you think some of the characters are you see here, and maybe the compelling research question, I would love to see them. And I don't want to rush you, but oh, good structure. DNA, shape, salts. Yes, double helix, what? Good, good. How is DNA structured? There is a compelling opening. I like that. Phosphates, good. Unsatisfactory. I appreciate that somebody saw this. Motivation. Ooh, good. Problem identification, hypothesis. Oh, teams. I see teams, and yeah. And the acids. Good, good, good. I'll just give it another minute. Caveats. Oh, I love it. The X-ray. Wonderful. Good, good, good. Forces. Oh, all of these are excellent answers, guys. Yeah, I feel like you guys are on track. I'm not worried about any of you. I'm gonna flip it to the next slide and just give you my quick and dirty view about like some critical things that are going on here in terms of story opening. This first sentence, we wish to suggest a structure for the salt of the nucleic acid. Like, it opens with the research question, and honestly, a huge part of what makes this paper really successful is it like does not waste any time. It gets right to an implied question. I mean, obviously the question, it doesn't have a question mark at the end, but like the fact that they're suggesting a structure means that there probably isn't a structure that's been given, right? So that's the central driving question, like what is the structure? And there's a lot of interesting things that are going on in here. I think some obvious answers to like what some of the characters are or what they become are there are chains, there are phosphates, there are fiber axes, there are bases. And there's, in this early part of the paper, it's sort of interesting. We've got these sort of components of DNA that are known, and they're sort of almost in conflict with past researchers and how past researchers have written about them in their papers, and how they've sort of encountered these past researchers, and the past researchers have found out some things about them, but not all things about them. And so there's sort of this continued tension, and it's sort of continuing to draw out, like it's building what is known and what is not known, which is really interesting to me. And there's there's emphasis throughout, even as we're sort of building in different characters. And there are quite a few characters in this paper. It is very complex because it cites so many other papers that came before it, but there's a continued emphasis on like what is sort of continued to be problematic. Like why is this not yet the structure? Why does this fact still not yet reveal the structure, even when we consider it in light of this other fact? So it's I think it's a fantastic read for that reason. I just thought I would have you spend another minute here towards the end. This is the next section that comes after those couple of paragraphs. It's on the Google document as well as on the slide now. I thought I would ask you guys, how does this passage do more than simply present data? How does it transform it into story? And there are about 1 million different right answers here, but if you could take about a minute and maybe try to find a way to respond to this question. There will be a different kind of format of question that will appear on the next slide. And if you need to still look at the Google Doc, maybe just make sure you've got it on hand, because I'm going to switch to the question slide. If you could take a stab, like how is this more than just presenting some data? How is this presenting a story? How is this advancing understanding? Discusses other views, plot twists, explains statements, explains gaps. Builds DNA with words. And you guys can upvote one another's answers, I think, if I'm understanding this feature right. If some other people are like not sure. I love all of these answers. You can visualize. Oh, good. Start at the beginning and move into their conclusion. Presents interpretation. Yeah. Good. Wonderful. I love this. This is so fantastic. Great. We're getting close to the end of this webinar, but I really appreciate, because honestly, what stands out to me too is the fact that we're not merely sort of like building an explanation based on sort of numeric facts and what data set we found first and what we found second and what we found third. The way this information is organized is it's organized in a way to actually help us build our visual understanding of what the ultimate structure for DNA looks like. So these two answers, you can visualize the item, painting a visual picture, are absolutely right. This idea too of discussing other views is also absolutely critical, because I think it is in the discussion of other views that the story really of what it looks like becomes apparent, right? Because it's sort of like a story, and I'm going to switch slides. It's a story of how past groups have kind of misunderstood what it looks like, or like seen just small glimpses, like, you know, through a mirror darkly or whatever, but they haven't been able to see the whole thing. And so it's this gradual reveal. and an ordering of information towards this gradual reveal that eventually builds our understanding of the whole molecule into a full picture. So thank you all for being really wonderful participants tonight. I think I don't even really have time for a question because it's 7:59 on my phone, but if you guys wanted to send me
Hey everyone, I'm so sorry to jump in, Charlotte. I know some of us are leaving at this point, so I just wanted to ask that you can all look out for our survey coming out, and please be sure to complete it as we and Charlotte have been so great to give us our time tonight. So thank you all for attending, and I will give it back to you, Charlotte. Have a great night, everyone.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if any of you guys want to send me follow-up questions via email, I'm happy to take any questions by email. I'm going to paste my email in the chat right now so you guys can have it. I'm just doing that right now. And other than that, I hope you have a wonderful evening. And like Sandra said, I hope you all stay safe out there. I know this has been a really trying time, but it's been a real honor to speak with you all this evening and to get to spend this time. I really loved how you contributed to all the polls. That it was really some wonderful responses. So I'm just going to type my email and then I'm going to sign off.